Hello, I'm David Grealish, computer historian and the producer-director of this film. I have a very personal connection with the Apple.Lisa, and so I want to start this film off with my story about that connection. Let's go back to almost 35 years ago. It's the fall of 1989, and I work for an Apple dealer in Gainesville, Florida, where the University of Florida is located. I had also worked at a few other computer stores before, as well as Apple dealers. By this time, though, my mind was made up that the future of personal computing was with the Macintosh. At least that's what I wanted to buy. The store I worked at was called Mini Concepts, and after I'd been working there for a while, I asked about buying a Mac with my employee discount. My dreams were dashed, however, as I found out that I had no hope in affording one. Even with my discount, which was modest, it would have cost me about $1,600 for the cheapest Mac system at that time, a Mac Plus with a generic external 20 megabyte hard drive. That's equivalent to about $4,000 in today's money. So it might as well have been $10,000, $20,000 in 1989 to my 25-year-old self. Well, one day a customer brought in what sort of looked like an oddly larger Mac into the store to be serviced. I was sitting at a computer across the store from the entrance, and I saw this guy struggling to carry the computer through the front door. When he left, I looked it over at the service counter and then asked our computer technician about it. He told me that it wasn't a Mac at all, but an Apple.Lisa, though sometimes referred to as a Macintosh XL. I was baffled, intrigued, and just so surprised to discover this Apple computer that I had never heard of before. The more I thought about it over time, the more fascinated I became. A few days later, I was flipping through the pages of either Mac User or Macworld magazine at the store when suddenly I noticed it. It was a regular ad in the back that ran from a company called Sun Remarketing. They were located in Logan, Utah, and in their ads they sold reconditioned Apple.Lisas. I decided to call them up and request a catalog. For about a month, I dreamed of and thought very hard about buying one. In the catalog I received, they were selling new, old stock Lisas that were upgraded to run as Macs. I could buy what was essentially a Mac Plus work-alike for just $1,095 plus shipping. When I decided to use my one credit card to make that purchase, I felt guilty just a little bit, but only a little, as I had just enough credit to buy one. So right after the Christmas of 1989, I received my Apple.Lisa like new as it arrived in its original box with original packing materials. It became both my first complete computer containing a display, disk drive, and a hard drive, plus it was my first Macintosh.
And on that fateful day in 1986, September of 1986, the trucks would come in here and would go up down the brim of that hill up there. So I remember the Lisas being buried just on the other side of the brim of that hill. And I'm not sure how much space this takes here, how many acres there are, but if you're going to dig, it would be on this end of it and not back in that area. But they all went there in the same place, and I came out that day just to see what was going on, and they were filming it, and they were making sure that they paid the tractor drivers to drive over the equipment to make sure that all of the Lisas were destroyed or damaged, so that nobody would come and try to salvage a computer. But this is it. I know that it was in that basic area that every one of those trucks went to. On that particular day, none of these buildings existed. They had an entry point, but it was just a shack at that point. So these are all new buildings since then.
Birds are all up there to your right now.
I knew about the Lisa before, obviously before the Mac was out, but before I was aware of the Mac. I'd heard of the Lisa when I was in high school as this wondrous thing, this almost workstation on a hill that was going to have this thing called the graphic user interface, and was going to be the latest and greatest, and it was going to allow you to do all this graphics and design and artwork, and it was something that you were never allowed to touch as a mere mortal, especially as a high school kid. And then they released the Macintosh, and that was the computer for the rest of us, and my journey began.
Well, up until the Apple.Lisa, all we had were command lines on a monochrome screen. That's what you had, whether it was an Apple, whether it was an IBM. It was all command lines with all these arcane words and commands to make anything happen. And if you're doing a document, word processing, you had no way to easily highlight or italicize or change fonts. You had to use all these suffixes and prefixes. And here comes the Lisa with the bitmap screen, the little icons, what you see is what you get. It's just a miracle.
And then if you look at the software, that is really, really the big inflection point for everything that is to come afterwards. So before that, you had Xerox PARC and you had the Alto and the Star. But with the Lisa, you actually, not only do you get windows and a mouse, you also get icons, you get menus, you get a lot of features that don't show up until much, much later, even in most recent Mac OSs.
This is a Macintosh. It comes from a little company called Apple. Apple was started in a small town in Northern California by two friends, Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak. United by their common interest in technology and dissatisfied with the attempts at personal computers by others, they knew they could do better and set out to make the world's first good personal computer in the form of the Apple I. The Apple I became the Apple II. The Apple II became the cornerstone of an industry that would change the world. In 1984, Apple introduced Macintosh, and Macintosh thrusted the industry forward into a new era. Its style and ease of use gave computers to the rest of us and inspired the next revolution in computing.
Of course, for the Mac 128K, they didn't have to reinvent the system of icons and the menu bar and all that. It was part of the Apple system, part of the Apple.Lisa system. So of course the Mac was a derivative of the Lisa. There's no way to get around it. It was absolutely a derivative of the Lisa.
Raskin, was going to do something. He didn't want a mouse. Everything was going to be with keyboard shortcuts. So obviously, I'm sure Steve Jobs all of a sudden coming onto the team and saying, "Oh no, we're doing something completely different." I'm sure it rankled quite a few feathers. That said, what he did was make something that was as easy to use, or maybe even easier than the Lisa, but he made it affordable.
The Lisa is significant because it sort of paved the way for the Mac, right? While many regard it as a failure, sort of a misstep, it was the Mac that kind of forced it out. But if it weren't for the Lisa, there wouldn't have been any Mac, right? The Mac was sort of almost lessons learned of the Lisa. How can we make Lisa cheaper? And to make it cheaper, we have to make it simple, and therefore we could, do things more efficiently, and really force the team to kind of take the idea of the Lisa, but implement it in a much more efficient way.
The Lisa was, I guess Apple didn't realize it at the time, but the Lisa was the prototype for the Macintosh. We were trying to build an office computer, and it was very graphical based, but it cost too much. So it wasn't really a success in the marketplace, but it laid the foundation that the Mac became. Mac became sort of the folks' Lisa, the computer for the rest of us.
The Lisa was inspired originally by the Alto at Xerox PARC. Steve had wrangled a way to get over to Xerox because he was curious to see what they were working on, and he met Larry Tesler, who eventually came to work at Apple. And he was absolutely fascinated by the idea that you could have a user experience that was graphical, because Steve's vision was that he wanted to focus on non-technical people. And non-technical people needed to be captured by the experience of using a computer, because they had no idea why would they even want a computer. And then he wanted the graphical user interface to be able to do things that were highly creative, like desktop publishing.
The initial goal was to take advantage of the 16-bit processor. I knew that we were going to implement some very sophisticated software on that processor, so I pushed for the 68,000, above the Intel world, because of memory management. The fellow that was reported to Tom in charge of the hardware was really pushing for function keys, some things like that, and we were trying to figure out, what the interface would really be for that could we create a new way of people operating on a computer? VisiCalc made Apple II successful. I mean, it took us from somewhat a successful company to a whole new level, right? The challenging, for us and Lisa was we were trying to do something that had never been done before, right? There were no books, there were no people to talk to, and so we were looking at pretty much everything. And then we did have the opportunity to go to Xerox because Xerox wanted to invest in Apple, and the same words were used, but it was basically, you open the kimono at Xerox PARC and we'll let you invest.
So there's a lot of stuff about that magical moment where Steve Jobs asked Xerox PARC to sort of open the kimono, as it were, and see all the secrets, and then they stole everything that they had. Well, that turns out not to be true if you're a historian. It turns out Apple actually paid for that visit and that technology. And it also turned out that Xerox wasn't really interested in that technology at all.
And once I did, I was given a demonstration of something I had never seen before. Basically, there was a CRT, this tube, a bunch of wires coming out of it, sitting on a plywood sort of stand, and somebody put their hand on a little sharp-edged lucite box that had 3 buttons on it and had a cord sort of attached back to that device. And when they moved that little box on the table, something moved on the screen. And that was the first time I'd seen anything like that. Right then it just clicked in my head that this was a game changer. This was going to be the future of computing. And just that quick little demo convinced me immediately it was a place I wanted to be and something I wanted to be part of.
Around the time Apple went public, maybe a few months after that, Bill Atkinson and I become Apple Fellows, where I did the early prototypes and of the 68K and the development tools. Bill was really kind of my customer, in addition to all the others. But Bill was doing all the graphics and all the screen-related stuff, all the pull-down menus and things. So what happened was Bill and Steve and I had gone up to Xerox PARC, I want to say late 79. Maybe Bill can tell you exactly when it was. And, you know, we saw what they were doing in terms of screen and menus and WYSIWYG and all that.
Xerox did a ton of research into human-computer interaction, graphical user interfaces, WYSIWYG document editing, laser printing, networking, with a machine called the Alto at Xerox PARC starting in the early 70s, 1973. And the Star is the culmination, or a culmination of that effort into the Alto was never a commercial product, but the Star was their first commercial endeavor into creating an office, the office of the future. It was envisioned that the Star would be one of many computers in a given office, kind of centered around laser printing, which is really Xerox's bread and butter. You'd have a laser printer, a file server, and you would have a number of these Star machines in your office. They would be networked together. People could use these machines to collaborate on documentation, send email to each other, laser print things, and just manage their office in a mostly paperless way, except of course when they were printing on their Xerox laser printer.
The Star, I mean, you were looking at $16,000 to get into the Star interface minimum in 1981-82 because the Star basically ran with a network. So that it was sold with file servers. It was sold with big workstations that drew a lot of amperage. So it was purchased by government and banks and people like that. Whereas Lisa was targeted not necessarily at those organizations. It was targeted at kind of a business, a medium-sized or small business, where you wanted a system on your desk for one user.
Bill came back to Apple, started imitating it, right? Steve got excited about it. Bill really got excited, and Bill's, starting to prototype the menus and things. And I think the thing that really caught fire was, simple things like the pull-down menus, right? And so Bill was working away on that madly.
We just saw some stuff that we've been thinking about, and in a sense we saw, the future of what we would like Apple to look like, and we'd like to bring it down from a $40,000 computer down to a smaller computer.
After the UCSD Pascal system shipped on the Apple II, Steve Jobs asked me to go work on this new project called the Lisa. And I had ported the graphics for the Apple II into the UCSD Pascal system, so I got to work on the graphics for the Lisa. And I was the main user interface guy and graphics guy for the Lisa. Well, some of the very early designs were that it would be more graphically oriented and would use a full bitmap display. On the Apple II, you could kind of put a character in a location, or they did have something called high-res graphics that was kind of a bitmap display, but it had its limitations. And the display on the Lisa would be full bitmap, and we wanted to be more graphically oriented. And one of the things that I had to do for that was figure out how to make that performant enough that you could actually do real applications with a full bitmap, where you had to set and clear lots more pixels to do any job. Initially, the Lisa hardware was going to be a bit slice processor, custom to Apple, and nobody else in the world would have one that had the same instruction set. It would be, custom bit slice. And Rich Page saved the day because he found that Motorola had gotten good silicon on the first turn on the 68000, and which was a beautiful processor that had a big wide address space, and he pretty much drove the decision to switch over to the 68000. It was fast enough that optimized assembly language could do the job fast enough that you didn't have to go to some fancy bit slice processor to do it.
The Lisa was really the environment where Apple could experiment with what Steve saw on the Alto, which was object-oriented behavior, where you could have a window and a panel come up in a dialog box. They would be objects. They would be attached to tasks in the background. They would have their own functions. So the complexity of the Lisa OS was a multitasking system, a true operating system. The Mac, which was in some sense cobbled together more quickly to run off of a floppy drive, wasn't multitasking. It wasn't object-oriented. It was a single application. So the Mac, in a sense, is an afterthought on the full architecture of the Lisa.
I think a lot of people think the Lisa is a failed platform. It's a computer that came out and was a big flop and it meant nothing to history. And I actually don't think that's true. I think particularly when you look at the software in the Lisa, so much of what's there, of course, informed the Mac, but there are also things that I think only now we're really thinking through and bringing into modern software. One of the things I think about when I think about the Lisa and its software is the error messages, which seems like a maybe silly thing, but the Lisa just has these excellently written, friendly, descriptive error messages. It's not error code 603, operation failed. It tells you exactly what's wrong and how to fix it in friendly terms that anybody can understand.
What I have here is a binder of Polaroids that I took from my Lisa prototype. There were only a few prototypes. I had one at my home at the time I lived in Santa Clara, and I would work on user interface issues. I'd take a Polaroid picture and I get on my motorcycle and I drive out to Apple and show people there. And so there was this kind of back and forth about the user interface. And I ended up with a bunch of Polaroids kind of documenting the piece by piece evolution of the Lisa user interface. This one shows the first characters on a Lisa display, and they are proportional width. That is, so we were used to on the Apple II, characters, an I character and a W character were the same width, and it was kind of lumpy. But now we could have, because we have a full bitmap display, this is a font that I handmade and wrote. So here I worked on, I redid the line drawing algorithms to be much faster. I worked out a polygon fill routine so that we could make things like filled, in this case, pie chart things. I did three-dimensional graphics things, so mapping 3D coordinates into a 2D and drawing shaded things. So this was the initial Lisa user interface with black background and the soft keys. We started playing with windows. This is the very first Windows on Lisa. This was not a window manager. It's just some one-off code that I wrote to draw some overlapping windows. What does it look like? because we were still using the full width and the hardware scrolling due to pointers. But when you start wanting to put things in Windows, you can't use that anymore. So how to deal with desktop clutter. And we thought, well, let's introduce something called a tray. You know, in a physical desk, you have inboxes and outboxes and some kind of trays that you organize your work in. So we invented something called the tray that you could make a document sort of zip into, but you could quickly get back to it. And that didn't last very long.
It wasn't until January of 1983, I still had not joined Apple. Steve and I were meeting almost every weekend for 5 months as we were getting to know each other, either in the East Coast or Silicon Valley. And in this case, Steve invited me to the Carlisle Hotel to see the first Lisa that I saw before the January 19th, 1983 introduction of the Lisa. And I was very impressed. And I got to see it at the same time that Steve was running a sneak program, John Couch was running a sneak program to show corporate potential buyers, you know, what the Lisa was, and everyone was impressed because they'd never seen a computer like this before.
The thing about the Star and the Alto being the prototype of the Star that, you know, eventually was sold, they tried to build what became later as a workstation, and workstations didn't exist back then. But if you look at the Lisa's not really a desktop, it's also a workstation. It actually has a lot of design philosophy that you'll see later on in things like SGI Indies and Sun workstations and HP workstations. So all the RISC stuff that came later on, you can see kind of that in the hardware design of Lisa, where you don't have just one CPU doing one thing, but rather you have 3 or 4 CPUs in the machine, each one doing a very specific task, and then you have one central CPU, which was the 68000 in Lisa, doing the major thing. And it's designed to be used by one user, not a whole bunch of users, even though it has a memory management unit, which, you know, things like the original Mac did not have. What you didn't have with Park was the whole desktop manager thing, where you have this virtual desktop in front of you and you have documents that iconize themselves to be small, and then you can switch between them. You didn't have the same kind of dialog boxes. You didn't have, I think at the very beginning with the Alto, I'm not sure about the Star, you didn't have overlapping windows, for example. So there was a ton of technology that was actually built at Apple by ex-Xerox employees that used to work on the Star and, you know, then worked on the Lisa itself.
Yeah, I think that there really is sort of no substitute for usability testing. You know, put your best thoughts into trying to make something easy to use and as simple as possible by thinking about it yourself, but until you really get it in front of people that aren't living with this thing every day like you are, you don't really know if you've hit the mark or not. And we certainly had a number of surprises. One story that I think Bill Atkinson likes to tell a lot is the story of the dialog box. It would pop up, which is a way of kind of interacting with the computer where it needs to get more information. You choose something and it puts up a little window and it gives you some information. And typically there's like 2 buttons there. One of them is cancel, and the other one is this sort of go ahead and do it operation. That's what it's intended for. And maybe it was because of the font that we were using in those days or whatever, but a number of people saw that second button, and instead of reading do it, they saw dolt. And they said, what is dolt? I have no idea what dolt is. And so we changed it to okay. And so that was one of the things that we learned, and we had no clue. For us, it was obvious, do it and do the operation. And I think, you know, I have to think about it a little bit more, but I mean, even to this day, when I am developing consumer products, I'm surprised sometimes at, you know, the way that people interact with those products. You know, not exactly what we expected when we designed it.
In 1983, I was a member of the Boston Computer Society, and I attended this meeting where they demoed the Lisa, and it was the first time I had seen windows and proportional fonts and a mouse, and my mind was totally blown. And I think everybody in the room had their minds totally blown because these concepts really had just barely emerged from the lab at that point. And a year later, the Mac came out, and the Mac got a lot more coverage by the mainstream press and was much more of a commercial success.
Well, I had bought a 2E back in 1983, and so I went into the computer store to get some software, and I looked over on the side, and there was this huge Apple computer sitting there. It was a Lisa 1, and I went over and looked at it, and I asked the guy, I said, "What is this?" He said, "Oh, that's the Lisa." He said, "You can play with it." I said, "How?" He said, "Use the mouse." I said, "What's that?" And so then I used the mouse, and I clicked, and the whole thing shut down. So I thought I had ruined it until I left. Oh, I was incredibly impressed. You know, I came back a couple of days later, and we talked about it, and I said, "Well, what's one of these cost?" He says, "Oh, like $9,000. And, well, okay, you know, I couldn't give up a year's salary. So I stayed with my Apple IIe.
Because if you ask me what's the single biggest mistake with Lisa, they wanted to support multitasking. You want to be able to use one app, move to another one, come back. That takes a lot of memory, and memory was pretty expensive, you know, in the early 80s, and that made the Lisa real expensive.
I can remember the first time I saw a Lisa computer, and I was 12 at a computer show in Wichita, Kansas. Back when they had computer shows, right? And it was, for a kid who'd only really had experience with Apple IIs and go to this computer show, and it's littered with vendors with all different kinds of computers. I mean, this is back in the day when, you know, there were dozens and dozens of different manufacturers that were cranking out examples. And I can remember, you know, going around and collecting the brochures for the Epsons and the K-Pros and the whatever. And then coming to this booth, and these people were gathered around looking at this thing, and I walked up to it. And that was the first time I'd ever laid eyes or even heard about, because, you know, in those days you didn't have the internet, you didn't really know what was going on in the computer industry, but first time I'd ever seen a Lisa in person being demoed there. And, you know, it was jaw-dropping. The screen, the things that they were doing, I'm not even sure I could properly gather it all in, you know, when you've never been exposed to something like that. And the guy said, "Hey, why don't you give it a try?" And I was so petrified, I said, no, that's okay, I'm fine. And I just kind of watched. But that was shocking to see that for the first time.
All right, so I'm sitting here in front of two of the pieces of equipment in my collection, my Lisa 2 and an original 128K Macintosh. Both of these systems were for sale in 1984. One looks a little more sophisticated than the other one. Lisa again introduced the graphical user interface to computing. So this was the desktop, having an office metaphor. You have files, you have folders, you have a trash can to put things away, you have a calculator, etc. You had a mouse with a pointer to select things on screen, and you had menus which gave you the choices of what you could do with the operating system or the document you were working with. The Macintosh now has a similar thing. You have a smaller screen in this case, but same idea, black and white graphical user interface, mouse works exactly the same way, menus to choose what you can do with documents. There is no hard drive in the first Macintosh. There was no hard drive in Macintoshes at all until about 4 or 5 years after the product came out. The Macintosh shipped with one floppy disk. If you had enough money, you had two floppies, and you could save your data on one drive without putting it in the other one. If not, you swapped floppies a lot. The Lisa 1 had an external hard drive that sat on top. The Lisa 2 has the hard drive inside, or you can get the drive that sat on top. So it had a hard drive back in 1983 when hard drives were the size of things that typically went in the cargo sections of airplanes. So much easier to save your work and not have to swap things. The Lisa is interesting in that it uses a metaphor called a document-centric model. Apple played around with this in the Macintosh in the mid-1990s with something called OpenDoc, for those of you who are real geeks and remember this thing. With a document-centric model, you're working on the document as your main item, and different programs can use it depending on what you need to do. If you need to use a graphic part of it, you need to use a word processing part of it, etc. The Macintosh has a program-centric model. You run a program and it opens a file, and you do things on that file, and then you save that file. You're running a program and you create files with the program. With the Lisa, you're working on a document and the program works in the background.
Well, it was very important when we introduced the first Macintosh that we be able to explain, where did Lisa fit into all of this? Because the Lisa sales were not doing well at all. And so we incorporated the same 3.5-inch disk drive that we had in the first Mac, which is the Sony disk drive, into the Lisa. We dropped the price significantly on the Lisa. There was never any expectation that we would recoup any of the money. We knew that the development cost of the Lisa was so expensive, and even at its prior pricing, there was no way to recoup the cost of it, even the development cost. So we were essentially subsidizing it in order to keep the focus on the Macintosh, that the Mac was really the future of the company, but we didn't want to get people distracted by saying, well, you told us a year ago that the Lisa was the future of the company back in 1983, before I came to Apple. So we didn't believe that was going to be a fix long term, but we said in the near term, it at least takes the eye off of this difficult to explain. Why did we say the Lisa was the future of the company in early 1983, and then in 1984 we say, nope, the Macintosh is the future of the company. So people would say, well, then where does Lisa fit in? It's so much more expensive than a Mac, and it doesn't do many of the things that the Mac could at that time. It was actually introduced as the Macintosh XL. It was kind of a kludge, unfortunately, because the goal was to have a Mac emulator, in it that would run on the same 68,000 processor. But the Lisa and the Mac were completely different operating systems. Most people saw through that, and the Lisa sales still didn't sell very well. I think the important thing, from my perspective, looking back on the Lisa, is that there were so many correct technical decisions that were made by the Lisa team. It's a superb technical team, but it was too early. Just like Newton was too early, the first Macintosh was too early. Apple was willing to take big risks and do ambitious things, but often way ahead of the curve in terms of what was possible with the physics. We just weren't at a point where microprocessors were able to do the heavy lift that they had to be able to do. So the Lisa actually had a really good multitasking operating system in it. Woz has told me many times, even in recent years, he said that the Lisa decisions on operating systems were actually much better than the ones that were made on the Mac, but the decisions on the Mac were made for a different purpose. Steve wanted to get a price point that could deliver a great user experience, And he didn't worry too much in those days whether he had, the right operating system. In fact, some people argue that there wasn't really an operating system. There were a lot of tricks, and some very clever engineers on the Mac group figured out how to make it look like a real operating system, but it was relatively thin in terms of its real capability. So over time, many of the ideas that were imagined and executed with the first Lisa found their way into the Macintosh. So Lisa did have a big influence over time on the Macintosh, but both the Mac in its first iteration and the Lisa in its first iteration were way too early from a physics standpoint.
I have thought about that, and I wasn't there. I think Steve Jobs turning his attention from the Lisa to the Mac can't have helped. But quite frankly, it was a $10,000 machine in 1983. The price dropped a little bit in 1984, but still, we were talking. It was not something the average person could justify buying, and it's especially with Apple being sort of, even at that time, a computer that was supposed to be for everyone. It's a little bit hard to sell enough to actually make something worth it if you're $10,000 in 1983.
As I recall talking to people, I don't think that Steve Jobs was the one who said, let's call it the Mac XL. I think that was a marketing strategy. The 2.5 had been discontinued. It was gone. The 210, it had the internal 10 megabyte hard drive, which they called the widget, of course, which sometimes it ran and sometimes it didn't run, and it would do crazy things. It wasn't very dependable. And then when they repackaged it as the Macintosh XL, all they did was stickers were sent to the dealers, and they would put a sticker on a Lisa case, the Lisa 210, and it says Macintosh XL. They didn't really market it very much. They just said, well, now the Apple-Lisa is now the Mac XL. You have this bigger screen and so on, and then it was gone. They hardly marketed it at all. I was there in those days. I mean, I was paying attention, and there it was in one issue of one of the computer magazines, and a couple months later, why, it's gone.
So, it was a 4 to 5 year effort to build this thing. You put that much time and energy, heart and soul, and we really were working just crazy hours. Yeah, when it doesn't become the big, commercial success, yeah, part of you just sort of like, just feels, pretty bad about it. And especially when you think that, if the thing had, continued to be supported for a few more years, took advantage of the, Moore's law, the doubling of processing power and more memory, and then prices coming down and stuff like that, that the thing, potentially could have been a commercial success, right? But since we had this, parallel activity with the Macintosh coming, into play, it made more sense to go with that. Even though, in a lot of ways, as I said before, it was a big step backwards. You could only run a single program at a time on the Macintosh.
And then some remarketing stepped in.
My relationship with Apple started when I was in college. I filled out an application that I saw in a magazine that said become an Apple computer dealer. And nobody came to see me. I just filled in the application. They sent me a letter back saying you're approved. This was 1978. And so at the time, my first order was, minimum order was 6 Apple IIs. And that was before the floppy disk drive was created. Had to hook them up to a cassette recorder to make them work. And it took me about 8 months to sell those 6 computers because it was so early that nobody wanted to do anything with it. But that was the basis of my Apple computer dealership here in Logan, Utah. And I ran that until 1984 when they came out with the Macintosh. And in 84, it was difficult to sustain that because most of my sales went to Utah State University here locally. And in 1984, when they came out with the Macintosh, they set up the bookstore as an authorized dealer, so all those sales dried up. And I thought, now what am I going to do? Well, in the meantime, we had been selling some Apple III utility software that we developed ourselves. And I also knew that they made a comment that everybody who had an Apple III on their desk in Cupertino, they wanted those Apple IIIs gathered, and they wanted to replace them all with Macintoshes because that was the future. And so I knew they had, 3,000 plus employees in California, so I contacted them and asked them what they wanted to do with all those Apple IIIs, and they said, I don't know, what's your plans? And so I put a mail order catalog together, and I sold a couple of them. And I'd call them back and order some more, and I'd sell those, and I'd call them back and order some more, and finally I called back and they said, the guy that you're ordering them from is in prison. He was keeping the money. And so I needed that business. That was my only source of income. And so I hopped a plane to California. And when I got there, they introduced me to a really nice guy named Jim Volkmar, who's still my friend today. And he said, what's your plans? And he basically just listened to what I had to say and supported it, and ended up giving us about 3,500 Apple IIIs on consignment. As we sold them, then we make a payment to Apple. And Bill Campbell called up one day and he says, you must be doing a real good job because we give your phone number away every single day and they never call us back. And I think he was just trying to butter me up because he says, now I want you to take these leases. And I was a whole lot less familiar with the Lisa than I was with the Apple III. I knew that we had a lot of service challenges with the Apple III, and I read about how many challenges we were going to have with the Lisas. And, but it was a consignment deal, so I didn't see that there was a whole lot of risk in it, and agreed to it. So for the first few months of the Lisa project, we had some serious challenges. The Twiggy drives wouldn't function. The widget drives were nearly universally broken. And so here we had these computers that basically would not function because they didn't have drives. And so we paid to find out a way to come up with a SCSI interface so that we could put a SCSI hard drive on it and eliminate the widget hard drive. And they had already come out with the 3.5-inch floppies, and so we just pulled any Twiggies that we found and replaced them with the 3.5-inch floppies, and that worked out fairly well. The aspect ratio, where it wasn't a square pixel, it was elongated pixel, was a fairly simple fix because we just had to burn ROMs so that we could replace that aspect ratio. Apple came up with the ROM for the aspect ratio. But to do it on the Lisas that we had, we burned ROMs, just in a ROM burner, and made that modification on the Lisas that we sold. And that kind of made them sellable. But they had MacWorks as a bootable environment so that you could use your Lisa like a Macintosh, and that's where all of our demands were. They wanted to use the Lisa like a Macintosh. And so we set out on a project to try to figure out how to improve MacWorks, call it MacWorks Plus, so that it had the functionality of a Macintosh Plus instead of just the 128K Macintosh that was available in the first one. So that was really quite an effort, and we got that. It was successful. It worked, and that's when the sales really started rolling on the Lisas. You know, the whole idea of selling used and reconditioned Apple equipment, first the Apple III and then the Lisas, we later, you know, started buying wherever we could buy and sell them as used. But it was kind of a difficult business model because the demand was for new and current models. And most people called us up and they wanted to buy a used, new and current model, which was impossible to come up with. So the only thing that we could do was sell what we had. And you know, I guess that's the dilemma of anything that's sold used, is that you can't do anything about your demands. You can only do what you got. Well, the main strategy was that we knew that demands were along the lines of current product. And so we wanted to make our products as current as possible. We would do all that we could to upgrade the operating systems and all that we could to upgrade memory or whatever else needed to be done so that they were current. In the later days of the business, we were buying USB cards so that we could add USB capability to machines that didn't have them previously. Well, my whole business was based on the concept of, you purchase this equipment, you need to keep it running. You know, we'll help you with service parts, we'll help you keep it running. If you want to buy a lower priced version of what's in the marketplace currently, that was kind of the whole thing that I wanted to accomplish. And so, yeah, I did not like the idea that Apple was going to take money from their customers, leave them stranded. When it broke, not give them any option to fix it. I didn't like any of that kind of stuff, and I wanted to build a business that would offset that kind of an idea. The business problem was that we got all of these leases kind of as a surprise. You know, here they come, and we didn't even have a place to put them, and so we were looking for storage places around the valley so that we could store them. And then we started finding out that the drives were a serious problem, that it only emulated the old version of the Macintosh. So, you know, we spent quite a few months at the initial setting to just figure out how to make these things sellable. And we were on path to that. It took us quite a while to do all the development that was necessary to sell them. And about the time that we got all that development done is when they recalled them and said, you can't have them anymore. It was, as a business, it was extremely difficult because there was really, you know, the crew that showed up that day looked like football players. They were muscle. They weren't corporate executives, you know, and their whole purpose in life was just to gather all these machines up. Now, when we received the Lisa, we just got boxes and scraps, and you know, sometimes we'd open them up and there'd be missing pieces and missing parts. A whole bunch of keyboards and mice never came. Power cords were a huge problem because they didn't get shipped back, and so we had to go source a whole bunch of those kinds of things. And when the muscle came to remove all the Lisas, they wanted a keyboard, a mouse, a complete system for every one that they took, and it left us with hardly anything that was sellable. I received, I can't remember, a telephone call or a letter saying that this is our inventory, we plan on taking it back. And, you know, I didn't have much to say about it, just that I didn't own the equipment, so I just had to agree to it. But I was surprised on that particular day when the crew showed up. They showed up with bins, you know, the trash bins that you roll in from the county landfill, and they put them in my loading dock, and they had a requirement to get a certain number of machines, and they wanted those machines to be totally complete with keyboards and with mice, and every one of them have all the memory cards, and every one of them have all the drives and everything associated with them, which was, you know, I was complaining about that because I didn't receive these machines complete. Far from complete, and yet they were taking every mouse in the house that they could find and every keyboard that they could find, which was going to leave me with, you know, basically a box and nothing else that was compatible with it. Where was I going to get Lisa keyboards? You know, that was a specialty item, and so that was extremely difficult. And then it took them, I think it took a couple of days to get all of them loaded up and moved to the landfill. I went to the landfill, and I could see that they were there with their cameras, and they were filming the whole thing, and they paid the landfill people extra money to actually run over them so that they were damaged in the landfill before they left, and they had that all on film. And because of paying landfill employees, one of the landfill employees thought it was newsworthy and called the Herald-Journal, the local newspaper, and they sent a crew out to film and to take pictures. And so I think that without that landfill employee calling and telling the local newspaper, it might be something that never got out. So I was pretty upset that day. I can remember sneaking onto the truck to recapture some mice and memory boards. Well, somebody said something about recouping tax credits, but I don't think that made a lot of sense. Maybe they had some imports for some of the components that they could recoup tax credits for, but no, I think that this was purely a ploy to get them off the market and not to have to compete in the Macintosh world with themselves. Steve Jobs was instrumental in this whole thing, and he was, I think it was before he left. Yeah, I know that I had some other people tell me, I didn't have any direct correspondence with Steve, but I had other people tell me that he didn't like the idea that they were selling anything used. He thought that everything used was competing against the new. They had a requirement to gather a certain number, and I think that the idea was that it would leave us with a few hundred, but the few hundred that they left us were so far from complete that it wasn't worthwhile. I remember about 3,500 that came, and I remember about 2,700 that were retrieved. We became known a little bit as somebody to go to if you're interested in the collectibles. And we tried to, bill ourselves that because we felt like there was a little bit of market demand that way. But yeah, I knew that because of the rarity of them that they would have some collectible value. And it seems like the first customers that had that kind of interest came from Japan at the point when we still had some inventory from Japanese customers. Yeah, there's people that were productive with it. Mm-hmm. One of my favorite stories is that when I first got Lisa's, I was approached by Stephen R. Covey, the author of 7 Habits of Highly Successful People. And he was interested in writing a book, and he had a seminar that he was teaching. And he said, I'll tell you what, I'll allow you to come to my seminar for free if you'll give me a Lisa. And so I gave him the Lisa. I loved the seminars. We went once a month for a year. And he assigned us a book in between each seminar, and he himself taught it. But anyway, the 7 Habits of Highly Successful People was written on a Lisa. After the Lisa, we set up a deal called the University Trade-In Program, where we partnered with Apple's sales reps, and we told universities, clear out your lab. We'll buy it all back, and and then the Apple guys will replace it with new product. And so we were quite successful in getting lots and lots of university pre-owned equipment, and we ended up selling nearly $100 million worth of used equipment over a 25-year period. And so it was good while it lasted, but then at the very end, it died because Steve Jobs basically said, we're going to sue you for copying our operating systems. And I said, for 25 years I've been putting operating systems on everything I've sold. I don't know what you're talking about. And he says, well, we're cutting you off as a dealer, so you can't buy parts from us anymore. And, you know, it was just one thing after another. I sold it to Cherokee Data, but basically all they got was my mailing list. And then they stopped doing it after a few years too, so.
And then I guess the last big deal was I contacted Sun Remarketing when they were starting to get out of the business. And I asked them if they would consider selling what all they had left as one lot. And so they agreed. And so we came to a price, and then they shipped them. I had them ship them on a tractor trailer, several pallets of them. And so I still have like about 30 leases left. I guess at my height, I must have had 150 or at least that many. I had so many of them, I had 2 storage units rented where I had leases, nothing in them but leases and Lisa parts. They got into trouble with the Lisa because of the $10,000 initial price. I think that sort of killed popular interest. It was the military, the government, banks, businesses, and universities that bought the leases. A normal person would not come out with $10,000 to get one. So I think that although there was a rise in its popularity when it was offered for $1,000, it was really too late for it. And all the enhancements that had been envisioned for it were canceled. You know, upgraded processors, upgraded screen, upgraded memory, upgraded capability. That was all dropped. And so it didn't, except for independent engineers, engineering companies that, you know, like James McPhail up in Canada with Sigma 7 systems, you know, there was the accelerator and then MacWorks Plus 2. Those came out and they sort of kept the Lisa up to date, but it wasn't any effort from Apple to do that.
Yeah.
The Lisa 1 had the Twiggy drives. You can, and so what makes the Lisa 1 are the Twiggy drives and the Lisa 1 faceplate, okay? If you take off the Lisa 1 faceplate, remove the Twiggy drives, change 3 EEPROMs, and clip 1 resistor, it's a Lisa 2.5. Every Lisa 2.5 was started life as a Lisa 1. Okay. The Lisa 2.5 was called a Lisa 2.5 because A, it wasn't a Lisa 1 anymore, they called it a 2, and the 5 was because it came with a 5 megabyte hard drive external to it called the Profile. And it had a 3.5-inch Sony floppy drive. The 210 was still a Lisa 2, meaning it wasn't a Lisa 1, and it had an internal 10 megabyte hard drive, okay, and it didn't have the stupid battery pack on the I/O board, all right, and that was it. It had an internal parallel port where the widget was connected, and it didn't have an external parallel port. The motherboard was different in that it only had the Macintosh XL, and this is 210 is the same thing. Okay, it had an internal parallel port and just 2 external serial ports. The Lisa 1, the Lisa 2.5 used the same motherboard, and they had an external parallel port and 2 external serial ports. When they started, Apple started touting the the Lisa 210 as the Macintosh XL, they issued and sold to dealers a screen mod kit to allow you to install that. The dealers, they didn't want a user to install it because you could electrocute yourself. The dealer would install that, which would change the aspect ratio of the screen to match the square Macintosh pixels. And that, at the same time, made it impossible for the users to ever run the Lisa Office system again. And so they didn't have to support anything like that. Well, I was always really interested in the Lisa. And then back in the early days of the internet, when there were bulletin boards and classified ads, I saw some people advertising Lisas for sale as groups, like they didn't want them anymore, or a school. And so I would contact them. You call them on the phone in those days, and I would set up, say, well, if I drive down and get them, what can I have them for? So they would say, well, if you can have 10, I've got 10, you can have them for $500. And I'd say, okay, I'll drive down. So I would drive here or there to get it. And I saw an opportunity. I thought that I could refurbish them, and with the capability of the Lisa, I could maybe make some money reselling them, because I like the Lisa, I like to work on them, I could repair them. And so I ended up, I guess the first time there was a guy in Florida, and I bought 15 Lisas with spare parts. That was after Sun Remarketing. I was a minute competitor, okay. All right? And so I got Lisas through buyouts from schools and from other collectors. And then I guess I had maybe, I don't know, 30 or 40 Lisas during that time, and I was refurbishing them and selling them. And then the opportunity came to get some stock from the old Lisa plant in Carrollton, Texas. A guy down there in Dallas had bought a bunch of that stock and had it in storage. And so I made a deal with him and went down and got a big rental truck load of them. I must have brought back 60 or 70, including 5 Lisa 1 systems. And then all kind of spare parts. So then I really started working on that, and I was fixing power supplies, and I was selling quite a bit of them. I was initially selling them as computers that could be used in a business, and so on, but none of my customers seemed interested in that. They wanted it because they liked the idea of it and the fact that they thought they could never own one, and I would refurbish them. You know, I would remove the dreaded screen mod if they didn't want that, or I could put the screen mod in. If you have the screen mod installed, you can't run the Lisa Office system anymore. If you tried to run MacWorks on a Lisa without screen mod, it would run fine, except the images were slightly elongated in the vertical axis. But if you put the screen mod in, then Macintosh software looks just like it would on a Mac Plus, but you could no longer run the Lisa Office System software. It won't work. The initial ROM in the Lisas was for 400K, the 400K Sony drive. Sun Remarketing invented the 800K ROM that would allow you to run certain, but not all, 800K drives. And for that, they found one called, I guess, what was it called? The Copal, C-O-P-A-L. And it was hard to find. They had a bunch of them, but after that was gone, not many of the Apple 800K drives would work. But we found that you can modify an Apple SuperDrive, 3.5-inch drive, and it would work as an 800K drive in a Lisa. My customers, even from the very beginning, were not interested in having a Lisa as a work computer. They wanted it as a collectible. They wanted to be able to do as much as they could with it. They just liked the idea of having this seminal machine that was really the first a computer for the public that had the user interface and integrated software. In the mid to late 90s, I had enough leases that I wanted to try to experiment with upgrading to an accelerator or a MacWorks Plus 2. And there was an old Dayfax, remember the Dayfax company? They would advertise those. And I learned that it was James McPhail of Sigma 7 Systems up in British Columbia, Canada, who had done the work on those. And so James was definitely the genius behind all that engineering. So I contacted James and I told him, I said, I'm trying to get this accelerator to work and so on. And he was concerned that I was just trying to get him to help me make money. And I said, oh, no. I said, I'm trying to get it to work for a friend and I'm mystified. And so he said, well, okay. So he started helping me with that. And then I asked him about MacWorks Plus 2, which takes a daughter board, in fact, to run that. And it gives it really enhanced capabilities of, you can run System 7 and so on the Lisa. And then we started talking about how we needed a dependable mass storage device for the Lisa. All you had was the profile and a widget, and they were bombing out and wearing out, and sometimes you'd start them up and it sounded like a B-17 revving up, and it was, they were just horrible devices. And so we both came up with the idea together of having a solid state device. And so James designed that on his own, the X Profile. He designed it and came up with some prototypes, which I tested here. And then we realized that if you wanted to install it in the old Profile case, that the Profile power supply was so unstable and erratic that the voltages varied all over the place, that you'd have to have a voltage regulator in order to install it in the Profile case. So he invented a voltage regulator board that you put in between the X Profile and the power supply. So you can use then an external X Profile with your Apple III.
So as I've started collecting more, most collectors begin to understand that their collection size is really only limited by the amount of space that they have. There's a fine line between hoarding and collecting. I think everyone can agree with that for those of us who are collectors. I've limited things to Macintosh because that's what I've used as my personal system, and there's a lot of other people who collect other types of computers. You don't need to do everything. However, the Macintosh didn't come out of nowhere. The Macintosh came out of an effort to develop a computer with what was then a groundbreaking thing called a graphical user interface, desktop office metaphor, menus, windows, icons, the mouse, all of that. The Mac was not Apple's first product to do this. Apple's first product to do this was the Lisa. The Lisa was the first thing that the general public saw of what became the general paradigm for computing. The graphical user interface, having an office metaphor, having menus available, not having to type commands in on the command line. It was very groundbreaking. A lot of what happened subsequent to that wouldn't have existed if the Lisa didn't exist. And then by the time I started using computers, the Lisa was long gone. It was out of production, it had been discontinued. Some unknown quantity of them were buried in a landfill in Utah, and people were selling them. They were repurposed as Macs and things like that. So I kind of always wanted one just to know what it was like and to play with it. I'd had the desire to get one, add one to my collection for that reason. Even though I specialize in Macs, this is really this is the first Mac, if you will. This is the first system of this vintage, of this lineage. The Lisa operating system is not the Mac operating system. It doesn't work one-to-one. It takes a little getting used to. But it's the essence of that design. And the Lisa had things in 1983 that the Mac didn't get until after the year 2001. So as a Mac collector, if you really want to know where the Mac came from, it's impossible not to include the Lisa in your thinking.
This is the coolest thing I have. So this is a Lisa 1 miniature that's been 3D printed by Charles Mangan. And I got into this through Adam Sommerfeld, who basically wanted to have a working Lisa miniature. And there's actually a little Raspberry Pi that's in here. You can see the connectors for over here, and you can see a little cable sticking out the back here. And so you can have a Raspberry Pi that uses one of the widget slots to hold an SD card and boot up Raspberry Pi OS, which runs Lisa M, and then you would see it on this little tiny display, which would have been great if it had a little bit more resolution, but you can always use the HDMI port instead. So this is a board I recently picked up. So this is a Vintage Micro soundboard, and it's called Lisa DAC, and what this does is it allows your Lisa to make the same sounds as the original Mac, and this is something that Vintage Micros just recently made, and this is a brand new remake of the original board. And I have yet to play with this, and what I plan to do with this is I want to take one of my Lisas and turn it into a Mac Works Plus platform, and then turn another one into running maybe just Uniplus and Xenix, and then the other one to just running Lisa OS. So this is one of the only rarities that I own for Lisa. This is a Subcommons poster. It came out around the time of the Lisa 1. It shows this little nice pattern. You see the dots that were used in their marketing copy and their documentation, and then there's one comment for every one of the apps that they had. There's a little Lisa 1 with a glowing white screen there and a mouse.
I don't know if too many people opened them up and looked at what was on the inside of it, but it was built to be extremely easy to service. You could use a thumb latch to open the back. You could slide the tray out. You could pull any card that you wanted to, drop any card in that you wanted to. They don't make computers like that anymore. If you have a computer that needs service, you're forced into sending it off. And so, because it was serviceable, it gave us a little bit of an ability to sell.
So this is Maca. As I started accumulating computers, this was an old, wasn't even a finished room, kind of a bonus room in the house, and eventually the computer just kept stacking up, in big piles all over the places I got them in. And so at some point I decided, well, let me renovate the room, make it a proper space to sort of display everything, and get rid of the stacks. So there are, in this room alone, probably 150 or so computers stacked floor to ceiling on these shelves. At the sides here, you got your iMacs and your different fruited colors, and then just a variety throughout the years. My collection spans almost the entire history of Apple. I don't have an Apple I, I don't have a Lisa one, but I have pretty much every single major model case variation in between. Walking down the line here, there's the original Macintosh from 1984. I've got a couple of those kicking around here, and then some of the early Macs from that era, you know, the Macintosh 2, of course, the very first really expandable Macintosh with slots. So these are kind of collectible. The Macintosh dealer sign, mine's not in perfect condition, got a little chip in the glass there, but these were sent to dealers when the Macintosh came out. Just, I don't know, you put that in the window to show Macintosh is here. Not sure how many of these were made, but they're pretty collectible these days to find one. Still working. It's lit underneath with a little fluorescent bulb, and of course just kind of lights up and shows the colors of the Picasso Macintosh logo. So this corner is sort of a junk pile of all things Apple. The desk, of course, the Lisa 2. I don't have a Lisa 1, but there's my Lisa 2 up in here. Of course, a few figures of the founder. iPods, now pretty much obsolete. But a variety of iPods throughout the years, including the first one, right? 1,000 songs in your pocket for a mere $399. And just a bunch of different compact Macs and various towers. And the stained glass here is pretty interesting. I'm told it hung at Apple headquarters, and somebody employed there had commissioned an artist, a stained glass artist, to make this. And so it's just beautiful, the workmanship into that.
First, if we start on the left-hand side of the room, what I've got on this table is the desktop and tower models of the Macs that I own. Any particular favorites? I would say my particular favorite of these has got to be the 6500. I really love the case design on that one. It was a great gaming system because it had a built-in subwoofer. Coming along to the back side of the room, I have my Mac Plus signed by Jimmy Doohan, Scotty from Star Trek. That was fun getting that. And Blue and White G3, Color Classic. This back wall has kind of got my favorites, and there's also a nice representation of the different processors and some of the different more unique case designs that Apple did over the years, particularly like the G4 iMac and the 20th anniversary Mac. This is my Apple IIe that I bought in high school. Still have it, still runs. This is my monitor computer pet that I bought the same year. So this thing is, what, 40 years old, 30 years old, something like that. Over here on this side, I've got my unfortunately not working Lisa 2 and Apple III and the Macintosh TV that I do have that is working. I think the Lisa is a very collectible computer. I think it's very sought after. Of course, it's not the easiest thing to find. Of course, if it's a Lisa 1, very, very hard to find. I would wonder, I don't know the numbers of how many of each were produced or how many were destroyed. I do believe it's a very collectible system. I would say somewhere between, depending on what it comes with, low end, really low end would probably be $1,000. I would say if you're going to get a nice one, probably $2,500, $3,000.
So what this is something quite curious. This is Gypsy, the computer oracle, which is actually a Ouija board. They couldn't use the term Ouija because that was trademarked. And you can see that it's showing a screen on either the Mac or the Lisa XL, showing the letters and numbers that your hands would be moved by spirit to spell out names or to communicate from the beyond. But instead of your hands moving across the Ouija board, the mouse would move and would move a cursor to pick the different letters so that the ancestors could speak to you. And if we open this up, but here's the board, which does not have the letters and numbers on it because that's what's going to be on the screen. And you are going to be using your mouse, right, locked into here, and you'll move it. I'll just give you a little demo here. So if I was running my Lisa XL version, and I'm running on this mouse mover, which has ball bearings, so that it's very light to the touch. So here it's like, spirit is moving me. A, L, I, S, A. I am Elisa. So this mouse mover. So it's where spirit meets, tech. There's becoming finally cool for once. If you gave your heart to Mac and Lisa, here's your reward. So here is the Xerox Star workstation with a mouse, with an optical mouse on its pad, and a wonderful keyboard design where you can use center, bold, italics, designed for document layout, big networked workstation, big hard drive, talks to servers, talks to printers, network attached printers. This is the Xerox Documenter system on the 6085, sold in thousands of organizations. Big screen, 19-inch monitor, pretty good for 1985. Full services, worldwide networking, Ethernet. Here's the modular design of the Star. Floppy drive, networking, removable modules, really good engineering. But again, an expensive system for mostly larger organizations.
Okay, so here we have some of the new boards that Sapient Technologies is producing. Actually, I build them, all of them. Here's the new Lisa 1.5, as we call it, I/O board. Call it that because you can use it as in the Lisa 1 or the 2.5. And you notice there's no battery pack corrosion that could ever be present here. It has a feature here with, see this jumper, you can switch, if you change the jumper, you can switch between the functionality for a Sony 3.5-inch drive or the Twiggy drives. When you switch to Twiggy, the R47 resistor is activated, and then it will run the part of the EEPROM that controls the Twiggy drive. All right, so there's that. Then here's the new CPU board. You can use either combo ROMs for to include Twiggy drive functionality, or what I have here, the usual H ROMs, which we see on all the more or less standard Lisa systems. Here we have a power on light, which is always useful to know when you're powered up. And there were some features with the Lisa that were never implemented for the ones that were sold. Here's a reverse video. You can switch from black to white as the backlit part of the video, and some of the programmers prefer the white background. So that was implemented here. Here is one of our new boards. My fingernails aren't long enough. Here's the new quad port serial board, which is a reincarnation of the old Tecmar board. And with this, you can run Xenix, Lisa Xenix and Lisa Unix, and network multiple systems. and also have a network between your Lisa, an old PC, a Mac 128K, or even your new MacBook. We decided not to recreate the original 512K Lisa RAM cards. That's not very much RAM. Sun Remarketing came out with a 2 meg RAM card, and when I bought out a lot of their stock, I got a bunch of these cards, and so these, if you can get the SIM holders, which are the hardest thing to find, are much more, I think, appealing to Lisa owners. So I can build these 2 megabyte cards instead of those. So we don't plan to recreate that because I've got quite a number of these blanks.
Well, I'm a Mac developer, and I think the ideas that are in the software on the Lisa are just fascinating. You can run the software in an emulator, but I like the experience of seeing how things worked on the original hardware, when they were new. I like hearing the hard drive spin up. I like waiting 5 minutes for the thing to boot because it's slow. I like feeling like somebody would have felt when they were using one new. I noticed that when the Lisa's running, it's loud. There are fans. The widget hard drive is cranking away, and it's not silent. And I actually think that's interesting because even from the very beginning, Apple seemed to care a lot about silence. And I think the Lisa was such a powerful machine that they couldn't do it, right. They couldn't get what they needed feature wise in sort of a silent, fanless kind of computer. Yeah, I'm quite an Apple collector, so focused on the Mac and the Apple II. I like Next computers as well. I kind of consider those like honorary Apple computers.
Bill and I were a little bit independent of Lisa and Macintosh, right? In other words, I was building some hardware and mostly software to support the 68,000 development, whether it be Lisa or Macintosh. And Bill was supporting the graphical user interface, first for Lisa, later for Macintosh, right? And so Bill and I were kind of in between. Now over time, he was a little more central to the Macintosh team, and I kind of stayed in the middle, which is a little awkward because, at some point there was a little bit of friction between the Lisa team and Steve, right? Mostly John and Steve, right? So, I worked at Apple for almost 7 years, and then I was at Next for almost 7 years. And I think I was the last of the Next founders to leave. Okay, so I kind of worked with Steve for 14 years. A lot of people didn't make it past 6 months with him, right? There's a long list of people probably that never made it past 6 months. So he wanted people that would be willing to challenge him and fight with him and argue with him. Now, he wouldn't always accept it, but that's what he wanted, right? My view was Steve was democratic. And what I mean is he treated everyone equally. Or if you're a little cynical, you could say he treated everyone equally badly. And that was kind of a problem because there was Steve, and then there were senior people, then there were less senior people. And the problem with the less senior people is they didn't have much experience with interacting with him. And so if he comes into somebody's cubicle and starts yelling at them, if they hadn't really had much practice interacting with him, it kind of scared them, right? And so one of the things that happened with the Lisa team was Steve just sort of treated everyone the same, and he went in to the team and interacted with some of them, was kind of yelling at them, and I think what happened was a few of them complained back up to John, and at some point John made the mistake, I think, of sort of uninviting Steve from the project. Up to that point, the project had Steve's support and approval. At the point where he wasn't involved anymore, the project kind of lost his support. And I'm not suggesting he kind of fought against it, but I think he didn't support it as he did before. And I think that was unfortunate.
You know, it's pretty clear to everybody that it didn't make sense for Apple to offer both of these products because they were similar but not the same. You know, the Lisa operated a little bit differently than the Mac, and so it, you know, and then obviously with the price point it ended up at, it, you know, was, you know, not selling and stuff like that. Although the same actually could be true for the Mac as well. The Mac came out quite a bit higher price than what was originally expected as well, and you know that was a, you know, a barrier for a lot of people.
The Mac was a success from the start in terms of people understanding it was important and loving it, but it was not instantly a great business success. And Apple's initial projections failed to come true. I was $2,500, so it was pretty expensive by the standards of the time. And it took a few years for things like desktop publishing to emerge and become the killer applications that led companies to invest in the Macintosh. So even the Mac was not an enormous business success immediately. The Apple was still a successful company because the Apple II was so dominant. And I mean, it's pretty amazing that the Apple II dates back to 1977, but well into the 80s, it was still really successful and an important profit center for the company. And it lasted into the early 90s, which seems hard to believe now that a 1970s microcomputer could still be selling in the early 90s, but particularly schools were so standardized on the Apple II that they just kept buying them. I'm sure Apple did not expect the Apple II to still be the profit center it was for as long as it was. It probably expected the Mac to become the center of the business more quickly than it did. I love the fact that the Vintage Computer Festival exists. I got interested in computers in 1978 when I was in junior high school. And at the time, I kind of felt like I was a latecomer to computers because I realized they'd been around for about 3 years. And all these decades later, it's fun to think about the fact that those of us who were into them back then got to live a little bit of history, even though we didn't realize it at the time.
I think we were just ahead of our time. You know, I used to have a philosophy in those days, which was code as if memory is free. And you know, I mean, code lasts a lot longer than the hardware. Right? The hardware is kind of continually upgraded, but software, that you're right, tends to hang around. Why would we still have COBOL? Why would we still have some of these, you know, languages around? And maybe we just got a little bit ahead of the game. Maybe we were too ambitious in what we were trying to do. And I think, you know, with the beauty of Steve is that I think Steve, it wasn't as if Steve would think smaller, but I think he would have thought more consumer. And I think we were sort of saying, well, look, we own the consumer market, right? How do we get the business market? One of the things that Apple did early on is, it gets back to, you know, it's more fun to be a pirate than join the Navy. Think about our 84 commercial, our 85 commercial. We made IBM the enemy. Culturally, they're the enemy, right? We're the hackers. You know, these guys march, and they're the British. We'll pop them off as they come by. And one of the things I thought about is we made them such an enemy that when the time came to partner with them, we couldn't partner. We're the enemy, right? And so we left the whole, you know, business world and community wide open for Microsoft to just march right in there with many, many years later, right? I mean, it's interesting. In my book, I was looking at the timelines, and I'm going, it took us probably 2 years longer than when I made the shift away from a traditional interface to the graphical interface to get the product out the door. It took Microsoft 3 years looking at it, having it as a start. It only took us two, you know.
Steve Jobs is absolutely the great genius that everyone imagined him to be. You know, many times people get remembered at being greater than they really were. In the case of Steve, he really was as great as people want to remember him. And he made brilliant decisions about innovation. And I always love the definition of genius as someone who can see the obvious 20 years ahead of the rest of us. And Steve had that ability. And he made decisions that made good sense in terms of vision, but he was not an engineer. And in those days, they used to call it in Silicon Valley, the Steve Jobs reality distortion field. And it was because Steve didn't feel bounded by the laws of physics. And so he often overestimated what was possible, even though he had this brilliant team. No one was better than Steve Jobs in terms of recruiting talent and getting them to do things. And he was an amazing taskmaster. He would drive people crazy, but at the same time they loved him and wanted to please him. And he was unique. He still is unique as a role model. I never had second thoughts about canceling the Lisa. I don't think anybody else did. And fortunately, some of the engineers went on to do other great stuff at Apple. For example, Larry Tesler became the head of the Newton team. Larry Tesler was the one who worked with Herman Hauser at Cambridge University to develop the ARM microprocessor. This became the first low-powered floating point processor that is built into every smartphone device today, including iPhones and Android phones. So the talent that worked at Lisa either ended up at Macintosh or ended up on Newton. In 1987, there are still quite a few thousand Lisas that had never sold, and financially, our CFO, Joe Graziano, said, hey, we ought to take a write-off on this, but they have to be destroyed. I think today those Lisas are probably worth many times what they sold for at list price, and there are a few of them in the Computer Museum, and there are collectors of the original Lisa.
Well, that ends another episode of the Retro Maccast with James and John. Until next week, remember, it's not old.
It's retro.
My personal Apple.Lisa was a very important computer in my life, as it provided me with my entry into the world of the Macintosh. The story of the Lisa is the origin story for all of contemporary personal computing. It was essentially the mother of our modern computing interface. Yes, there were other developmental computers with a mouse and a graphical user interface, plus even a computer with these things that was sold commercially by Xerox. However, the Lisa had something none of those had that further ties it to our modern hardware, the microprocessor. With that distinction, the Lisa was the first true personal computer with a graphical user interface mouse combination. It might not have been a market success, but it was certainly a phenomenal cultural success in its influence on personal computing. The Macintosh's lineage is tied to it.